Hi, welcome to our module on the Shoa, that is the Jewish genocide, and in particular the memory of the Shoa and the function of this memory in the US today, mostly among Jews. As you listen to this lecture and as you keep reading, I would like you to keep two questions in mind. One, why is the Holocaust so important for American Jewish identity? And secondly, should the Holocaust remain this important? What do you think? What do we mean by Shoa? It is the systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of approximately 6 million Jews. By May 1945, about 2 out of every 3 Jews in Europe have been murdered. It's also the murder of many millions of others by the Nazis and their collaborators during World War II. Mass killings began in June 1941 with the shooting of Jewish civilians during the German invasion of the Soviet Union. At the end of 1941, the Germans began deporting Jews to killing centers in occupied Poland. So, who was murdered in the Holocaust? Six million Jews, Sinti and Roma, who were among the groups singled out on racial grounds for persecution by the regime. The Roma were subjected to internment, deportation, and forced labor, and they were sent to extermination camps. Einsatzgruppen, that is, mobile killing units, also killed tens of thousands of Roma in German-occupied eastern territories. So in many ways, the fate of the Roma closely paralleled that of the Jews. It's very difficult to determine the number of Roma killed during the Holocaust. Before the war, about 1 million Roma lived in Europe, and between 200 and 500,000 were killed. In addition, 2 to 3 million Soviet prisoners of war were murdered or died of starvation, disease, neglect, or maltreatment. And then about 200,000 physically and mentally disabled people who were living in German institutions. This was the so-called euthanasia program, good death, a euphemism for systematic killings. It's often been seen as a sort of a dry run, as an early program of mass murder that predated the Shoah. During the wars, also about 5,000 children were killed in this program. Also, gay men, less so lesbian women, and other LGBTQ minorities, political opponents, and religious dissidents. And even more so, millions of Polish and Soviet civilians were deported for forced labor in Germany and Poland, many of whom died. The non-Jewish intelligentsia. And in general, thousands of political opponents were targeted. Communists, socialists, trade unionists, and religious witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses. Many of these individuals mentioned here died as a result of incarceration and maltreatment. This arguably had a huge influence on American Jewish identity. It was an unprecedented catastrophe in human civilization, and it happened because it could happen. And because it happened once, you could say it can happen again, and of course it has. Between 1900 and 1987, close to 170 million civilians were killed by governments and quasi-governmental organizations, most of them by non-democratic regimes. Democide, that is, the killing of peoples, meant that 38 million people were victims of genocide, 6 million of those in the Shoah. So the Shoah then can be seen as a precedent, as sort of a case study for genocide. There are various models on how to understand this. It did not have to happen. Others say it was inevitable, especially considering that for some, the Holocaust was Hitler's intentions from the very beginning, while others think that social and economic structures in particular led to impasses that first forced Germany to take such radical solutions. So what is the Shoah? Is it definable? Is it even desirable to define it? Historians have stressed that we must compare it to other events. We won't be doing this here much. I'm just mentioning these things to point out that we're not just studying Jewish history here, but we're studying one genocide among many, but one that often became a case study or remains a case study for genocide studies. What do we mean by genocide? After receiving the news about the events in Poland, Czechia, Serbia, Russia, etc., this term was coined by a refugee, a Polish Jewish lawyer in the US by the name of Raphael Lemkin in late 1942 maybe. He had several definitions. He saw in genocide the total destruction of a nation or of an ethnic group, or one that left some or many individuals alive. This definition was adopted by the United Nations in the Genocide Convention on December 9, 1948. Any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a nation, ethnic, or religious group as such. Some have added political groups. You could argue that the latter two, religious and political, involve an element of choice, but they're still included here. Genocide, then, is the planned attempt to destroy a national, ethnic, or racial group by mass murder. Why should we care? Because it might help us differentiate between different types of crimes against humanity. So what do these terms actually mean? Holocaust is a word from the Greek, and it means sacrifice by fire. It's a sacrifice where an animal is entirely burned. Churban or churban, destruction, it's a Hebrew word, or pronounced really in the Yiddish. And then Shoah, that is the standard term since the 1940s in Europe and in Israel, and it means as much as calamity. So what do you think? Why do we have different terms? Does it matter what we use? We'll mostly look at the Jewish Shoah this week, but this is not to diminish the other victims in the other victims in Europe. In 1933, the Jewish population of Europe amounted to about 9 million people. Most lived in countries that Nazi Germany would occupy or influence during World War II. By 1945, the Germans and their collaborators killed nearly 2 out of every 3 European Jews as part of the so-called final solution, the Nazi policy to murder the Jews of Europe. How did they do it? Who perpetrated it? Hitler himself seems to have been intimately involved. He pointed out directions. And all areas of German society, as research has shown now, was involved. All became part of this consensus. In the early years of the regime, after 1933, Nazis established concentration camps to imprison real and imagined political and ideological opponents. And you can see them here mentioned, the squares here, Jews, Roma, and other victims of ethnic and racial hatred there. These camps were established on the local level throughout Germany. Gradually, most of these early camps were disbanded and replaced by centrally organized concentration camps under the exclusive jurisdiction of the SS Schutzstaffel, the elite guard of the Nazi state. By 1939, 7 large concentration camps had been established. Besides Dachau, they were Sachsenhausen, north of Berlin, Buchenwald, near Weimar, Neuengamme, near Hamburg, Flossenbürg, Mauthausen, and Ravensbrück. They created ghettos, transit camps, forced labor camps to concentrate Jewish populations and to facilitate deportation. During World War II, Germans established ghettos mainly in Eastern Europe and also in Hungary. A ghetto was an enclosed district or several districts of a city in which the Jewish population was forced to live under extreme conditions. The establishment of Jewish ghettos was a provisional measure to control, isolate, and segregate Jews. Beginning in 1942, after the decision had been made to kill the Jews, the ghettos were systematically destroyed, and surviving Jews were sent to extermination camps where they were killed. Germany used modern infrastructure, for instance, the railroad system. Check out this map here. Cities with a Jewish population of 40,000 or greater are mentioned here. At the Wannsee Conference in Berlin in January 1942, the SS and representatives of the German government estimated that the final solution, the Nazi plan to kill the Jews of Europe, would involve 11 million Jews, including those from non-occupied countries such as Ireland, Sweden, Turkey, and Great Britain. Jews from Germany and German-occupied Europe were deported by rail to extermination camps in occupied Poland, where they were killed. The Germans attempted to disguise their intentions, referring to deportations as resettlements to the east. Victims were told that they were to be taken to labor camps, but really, from 1942 onwards, deportation meant transit to killing centers for most Jews. After the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, mobile killing units right behind the front carried out mass murders. Between 1941 and 1944, millions of Jews were deported from Germany after years of progressive isolation. This isolation included everything from prohibiting Jewish children from going to public schools, from bans for lawyers, doctors, and many others. There were even prohibitions to own pets, to get a haircut, or to buy garlic. Let's talk a little bit about resistance. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is the best known incident of resistance, but there were many others. Many Jews in ghettos across Eastern Europe tried to organize resistance against the Germans and to arm themselves with smuggled and homemade weapons. Between 1941 and 1943, about 100 Jewish groups formed out in the underground to perpetrate acts of resistance. For example, about 1,000 Jewish prisoners participated in the revolt in Treblinka. On August 2nd, 1943, Jews seized whatever weapons they could find, picks, axes, and even firearms stolen from the camp armory, and they set fire to the camp. About 200 managed to escape. The Germans recaptured and killed about half of them. On October 14, 1943, prisoners in Sobibor killed 11 SS guards and police auxiliaries and set the camp on fire. Again, about 300 prisoners escaped, breaking through the barbed wire and risking their lives in the minefields surrounding the camp. Over 100 were recaptured and later shot. And there were others. 1944 at Auschwitz-Birkenau, when people assigned to the crematorium rebelled after they learned that they too would be killed. But the most famous armed resistance occurred in the Warsaw Ghetto. And until only a few years ago, a survivor of this revolt lived right here in Colombia. He has since passed away. As he would often say when we would ask him, and he only spoke about this very late in life, he would say that he didn't fight himself, but that he was a weapons runner through the sewers. In the summer of 1942, about 300,000 Jews were deported from Warsaw to Treblinka. When reports of mass murder in the killing center leaked back to the Warsaw Ghetto, a surviving group of mostly young people formed an organization that was called ZOB, a Polish abbreviation for Jewish Fighting Organization. Led by a 23-year-old, they issued a proclamation calling for Jews to resist going to the railroad cars. And in January 43, Warsaw Ghetto fighters fired upon German troops as they tried to round up another group of inhabitants for deportation. After a few days, the troops retreated, and this was a small victory, but it inspired the ghetto fighters to prepare for further resistance. And so on April 19th, 1943, on the eve of Passover, think about this timing, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising began after troops and police entered the ghetto to deport its surviving inhabitants. 750 fighters fought the heavily and well-trained army. Not army, sorry. SS and others. The ghetto fighters were able to hold out for nearly a month, but on May 16th, 1943, the revolt ended. Of the more than 56,000 Jews captured, about 7,000 were shot, and the remainder were deported to camps. Hundreds survived, hidden in underground bunkers. Camp by camp, the prisoners were liberated by Americans, by Russians, by British troops. Today, the Shoah is remembered in many ways. Of course, it is remembered on a personal level by many whose ancestors were survivors. But there are also official days of remembrance. So, for example, there are days of remembrance from the Holocaust Museum in DC. There are always events surrounding the week of Yom HaShoah, the Day of Remembrance of the Shoah and heroism. That's mostly in Israel. It's on the 27th day of the month in the Hebrew calendar called Nisan. That is, it's a week after the 7th day of Passover. So it's very close to the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And it is also 1 week before Yom HaZikaron, the Memorial Day for Israel's fallen soldier. In Israel, it's marked by sirens at sundown and at 11 a.m. for 2 minutes. There's a lot of controversy surrounding this day because the ghetto fighters wanted a different date. They wanted the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising on Nisan, 14th to 15th Nisan. Ultra-Orthodox Jews wanted a totally different day. They wanted a day in the month of Iyar, and they refused the date of they really rejected the date of the ghetto uprising because it would fall into the month of Nisan, that according to tradition is a joyful month. Internationally observed as January 27th, the day of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest death camp. Many religious Jews, or some religious Jews, I should say, prefer the 10th of Tevet, that is one of the traditional so-called minor fast days that commemorates the beginning of the siege in Jerusalem. And the idea here is to take a day that is already there and that already remembers something terrible happening in Jewish history and to infuse it with new meaning. Another date that commemorates the Holocaust is November 9th, the night of broken glass. That is the night when in German or in areas ruled by Germany, Jewish businesses, synagogues and other institutions were often destroyed, often put on fire, and broken glass because of the broken windows of shops and synagogues. And people were arrested. It's often seen as sort of the beginning of a new stage in persecution. Many people have argued that Jewish memory of the Holocaust only began, or commemoration of the Holocaust only began with the Eichmann trials in Jerusalem in 1961. Eichmann was one of the architects. And as an example, I'm bringing you an excerpt that I also am asking you to read by Chassia Diner, a professor at New York University. She wrote a book called We Remember with Reverence and Love. She argues and shows, the Jews began to discuss the impact of the Shoah even while they were still in the camps. They began to document what was happening to them already in Theresienstadt. And immediately upon their liberation, people began to think about how to commemorate this publicly. In the US, survivors began to hold yearly ceremonies that soon involved public officials, that is, non-Jewish officials as well. There's literature, there's stories, there were bar mitzvah gifts, books, there were histories written, there were political monuments, they dedicated parks. What's the result of this? Today we have Holocaust museums in all major cities throughout the US. There are parks, there are memorial marks in parks. All of these highlight individual memory. They stress the Jews lived in modern Western societies all throughout Europe, not just in Eastern Europe. They show how they witnessed, responded, and coped. There's been a vehement controversy initiated by Theodor Adorno, by the philosopher Adorno, regarding the legitimacy of representing Auschwitz through art. Can there be even art after Auschwitz is asked? Nonetheless, of course, yes, the Holocaust continues to be commemorated through art. In fiction, famous here is Night by Elie Wiesel, that you maybe read in high school or that you read in any way. Today, 2,000 Holocaust memoirs have been published in 20 languages. There are diaries, eyewitness accounts, there are memoirs, there's fiction, there's poetry that blurs sort of to autobiography, fiction, historical monographs. Some are close to adventure tales. The second generation has had even more problems to sort of commemorate the Holocaust. And think of Mouse, which some of you might know, the cartoon that merges cartoon with autobiography. So can anyone write about the Holocaust is a question you might